Have a good day, everyone. We are the group 4 and we will be discussing about behaviorism and neo-behaviorism.
What is behaviorism? Behaviorism is an aspect of psychology that studies the behavior and mental processes of humans. It is a branch of psychology that studies humans' behavior and mental processes with emphasis on how they impact human responses to external stimuli. The effect in which one stimulus initiates a response or pattern in another organism is known as stimulus generalization. Behaviorists believe this principle explains why some people learn more quickly from praise than others do.
Hello everyone, I am Geoffrey Delfino and I am going to discuss two philosophers under behaviorism. So let's begin with Ivan Pavlov. He is a Russian physiologist and he is well known for his work in classical conditioning or stimulus substitution. His most renowned experiment involved meat, a dog, and a bell. So Pavlov was measuring the dog's salivation in order to study digestions. So we have here an illustration of Ivan Pavlov's experiment under classical conditioning. So in stage 1, before conditioning, we have a bell which is a neutral stimulus and there is no expected response from the dog. Then we have stage 2 during conditioning. So here, a bell paired with meat which is unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response from the dog is salivation. Then in stage 3, the bell which is already a conditioned stimulus and the response from the dog is salivation and it is already a conditioned response. However, classical conditioning is not only focuses on this Ivan Pavlov's experiment. It can also applied in different aspects. So for example, if you are associated with an object from your teacher, so at present, if you encounter the same objects, you will be reminded with that teacher. Then we have here facilitating learner-centered teaching. So first, stimulus generalization, next, extinction, spontaneous recovery, discrimination, and higher order conditioning. Now we have stimulus generalization. Once the dog has learned to salivate at the sound of the bell, it will salivate at the similar sounds. If the dog hear a sound similar to the bell, he will salivate thinking that there is a food for him. The next, extinction. If you stop pairing the bell with the food, salivation will eventually cease in response to the bell. Then spontaneous recovery. Extinguished responses can be recovered after an elapsed time, but will soon extinguish again if the dog is not presented with food. The next is discrimination. The dog could learn to discriminate between similar bells and discern which bell would result in the presentation of food or which would not. And lastly, higher order conditioning. Once the dog has been conditioned to associate the bell with food, another unconditioned stimulus, such as a light, may be flashed at the same time that the bell is rung. So eventually, the dog will salivate at the flash of the light without the sound of the bell. Then let's proceed to the next behaviorist, Edward L. Thorndike. He is an American influential psychologist and often referred to as the founder of the modern psychology. Edward Thorndike has a theory on connectionism. Theory on connectionism stated that learning has taken place when a strong connection or bond between stimulus and response is formed. So this is based on the connection between stimulus and response. Theory on connectionism have three related laws. First, we have law of effect. The law of effect states that a connection between a stimulus and response is strengthened when the consequence is positive, and the connection between the stimulus and the response is weakened when the consequence is negative. So this law is directional. Why? Because it follows the same direction where the strengthened has the consequence of positive and the weakened related to the consequence of negative. However, Thorndike later on revised this law when he found out that negative reward does not necessarily weaken the bond, and that some seemingly pleasurable consequences do not necessarily motivate performance. So he realized that not all the time if you give a negative reward, which is the punishment, can weaken the bond. So let's say for instance, if sultian ang student sa iyang teacher na if gamay iyang score makuha sa exams, hagbungon siya. So other students think it is negative. However, there are students will become more motivated to get higher scores. So in this case, the effect is opposing. So it follows that whatever consequence he will experience would based on his following decisions. The next law is the law of exercise. This tells us that the more an stimulus response bond is practiced, the stronger it will become. So practice makes perfect seems to be associated with this. However, like the law of effect, the law of exercise also had to be revised when Thorndike found out that practice without feedback does not necessarily enhance performance. Let's say you are practicing a dance, but you are practicing a wrong action. Do you think it will enhance your performance? No. So that's why Thorndike realized that practice without feedback does not necessarily enhance performance. So as you do your practice, be sure to have feedback from your teacher or from your choreographer. Then we have the law of readiness. This states that more readiness the learner has to respond to the stimulus, the stronger will be the bond between them. When a person is ready to respond to a stimulus and is not made to respond, it will become annoying to the person. So you are prepared, but there is no expected response from you. So what will happen? You will become irritated and annoyed. Then we have the principles derived from Thorndike's connectionism. First, learning requires both practice and rewards. So this is from the law of effect and exercise. The next, a series of stimulus response connections can be chained together if they belong to the same action sequence. So this is from the law of readiness. Then third, transfer a learning course because of previously encountered situation. Then lastly, intelligence is a function of the number of connections learned. So the connections you learn from the stimulus and response, and then you connect them together to form a intelligence. Okay, so that's all for my report. The other two behaviorists will be discussed by Mr. QT de la Cruz.
Hello everyone, I am Joshua Dominic de la Cruz from Group 4 and I am tasked to report about the works of the two behaviorists John Watson and Frederick Skinner. So first is John Watson. Watson was the first American psychologist to work with Pavlov's idea. He too was initially involved in animal studies, then later became involved in human behavior research. He considered that humans are born with a few reflexes and emotional reaction of love and rage. The experiment on Albert. Watson applied classical conditioning in his experiment concerning Albert, a young child and a white rat. In the beginning, Albert was not afraid of the rat, but Watson made a sudden loud noise each time Albert touched the rat. Because Albert was frightened by the loud noise, he soon became conditioned to fear and avoid the rat. Later, the child's response was generalized to other small animals. Now he was also afraid of small animals. Watson then extinguished or made the child unlearn fear by showing the rat without the loud noise. Watson's research method would be questioned today. Nevertheless, his work did clearly show the role of conditioning in the development of emotional responses to certain stimuli. This may help us understand the fears, phobias, and prejudices that people develop. So next, behaviorist, Burroughs Frederick Skinner. Skinner believed in the stimulus-response pattern of conditioned behavior. His theory zeroed in only changes in observable behavior, including any likelihood of any process taking place in the mind. Skinner's 1948 book, Walden 2, is about a utopian society based on operant conditioning. He also wrote A Science in Human Behavior in 1953, in which he pointed out how the principles of operant conditioning function in social institutions such as government, law, religion, economics, and education. So, operant conditioning, specific consequences are associated with voluntary behavior, rewards introduced to increase a behavior, and punishment introduced to decrease a behavior. Operant conditioning is based upon the notion that learning is a result of change in overt behavior. Changes in behavior are the result of an individual's response to events or stimuli that occur in the environment. A response produces a consequence. S to R pattern. When a particular stimulus response or SR pattern is reinforced or rewarded, the individual is conditioned to respond. Reinforcement. Reinforcement is the key element in Skinner's SR theory. A reinforcer is anything that strengthens the desired response. There is a positive reinforcer and a negative reinforcer. So, positive reinforcer is a stimulus that given or added to increase the response. So, for example, if a teacher said that you will have a free time because you perfect the exam, a negative reinforces is a stimulus that results in the increased frequency of response when it is withdrawn or removed. Note, a negative reinforces is not a punishment. In fact, it is a reward. A reward. For example, if na-perfect ka sa imong summative test, dili nakapatikon og periodical test. So, that is like a reward nga nakuha. Like, so, lahi siya sa punishment because the punishment is a consequence intended to result in reduced responses. Extinction. Skinner also looked into extinction or non-reinforcement. Responses that are not reinforced are not likely to be repeated. Shaping of behavior. An animal is on a cage may take a very long time to figure out that pressing a lever will produce food. To accomplish such behavior, successive approximation of behavior are rewarded until the animals learn the association between the lever and the food reward. So, for example, karon nakato na siya og paduol sa lever, nakato na, and then next nakato na siya og hikap sa lever, and then next nakato na siya og press sa lever. So, mo na shaping of behavior. Behavioral chaining comes about when a series of steps are needed to be learned. The animal would master each step in consequence until the entire sequence is learned. This can be applied a child being taught to tie a shoelace. Reinforcement schedules. Once the desired behavioral response is accomplished, reinforcement does not have to be 100%. In fact, it can be maintained more successfully through what Skinner referred to as partial reinforcement schedules. Partial reinforcement schedules include interval schedules and ratio schedules. Kinds of schedule. Fixed interval schedules. The target response is reinforced after fixed amount of time has passed since the last reinforcement. So, for example, karon gitagaan ka, and then a fixed interval schedule, tagaan na pug ka every 10 minutes. So, kada 10 minutes. And then variable interval schedule. This is similar to fixed interval schedules, but the amount of time that must pass between reinforcement varies. So, dili pareha ang time. Then, fixed ratio schedule. A fixed number of correct responses must occur before enforcement may occur. So, for example, katong animal nga mag-press og lever para matagan siya reward. If maka-press siya og 10, every time 10 ka press, aya siya mohatag reward. So, in the variable ratio schedule, the number of correct repetition of the correct responses for reinforcement varies. So, lahi pod ni siya. For example, karon 5 ka press nga lever, sa sunod na pod lahi na pod sa 7 or 8 or anything a number. Application of operant conditioning. One, practice should take the form of question, stimulus, answer, response, frames which expose the student to subject in gradual steps. Two, requires that the learner makes a response for every frame and receives immediate feedback. Three, try to arrange the difficulty of the question so the response is always correct and hence a positive reinforcement. Four, ensure that good performance in lesson is paired with secondary reinforcers such as verbal praise, prize, and good grades. Principle derived from Skinner's operant conditioning. One is behavior that is positively reinforced will occur. Intermittent reinforcement is particularly effective. Information should be presented in small amounts so that responses can be reinforced or shaping. 3. Reinforcements will generalize across similar stimuli or stimulus generalization, producing secondary conditioning. So that's all. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I am Ayan Sidungog, your third reporter for this lesson, and I will be introducing the neo-behavioralism and will tackle the first theory of neo-behaviorism, which is Tolman's purposive behaviorism. Neo-behaviorism. With new researches, explanations provided by the basic principles of behaviorism appeared not to satisfy all learning scenarios. New theories came into view which maintained some of the behaviorist concepts but excluded others, and added new ideas which later came to be associated with the cognitive views of learning. The neo-behaviorists, then, were a transitional group bridging the gap between behaviorism and cognitive theories of learning. Note that neo-behaviorism is associated with the cognitive views of learning. We then explain with the next discussion why it is the transitional group bridging the gap between behaviorism and cognitive theories of learning. So as you can see in the advanced organizer, neo-behaviorism is divided by two theories. We have the Tolman's purposive behaviorism and the Bandora's social learning theory. Under Tolman's purposive behavioralism, we have the goal-directedness, the cognitive maps, latent learning, and the intervening variables. While in Bandora's social learning theory, we have the principles, the modeling, and the four conditions for effective modeling. So, Edward C. Tolman was an American psychologist and a professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley. Through Tolman's theories and works, he founded what is now a branch of psychology known as purposive behaviorism. Tolman's purposive behaviorism. Purposive behaviorism has also been referred to as sign learning theory and is often seen as the link between behaviorism and cognitive theory. Tolman's theory was founded on two psychological views, those of the Gestalt psychologist and those of John Watson, the behaviorist. So what is Gestalt psychology? Gestalt psychology is a school of thought that looks at the human mind and behavior as a whole. When trying to make sense of the world around us, Gestalt psychology suggests that we do not simply focus on every small component. Instead, our minds tend to perceive objects as part of a greater whole and as elements of more complex systems. Then, the John Watson, the behaviorist, was tackled by or was discussed by Mr. Joshua de la Cruz earlier. The next, Tolman believed that learning is a cognitive process Learning involves forming beliefs and obtaining knowledge about the environment and then revealing that knowledge through purposeful and goal-directed behavior. So these are the Tolman's key concepts. We have the learning is always purposive and goal-directed, the cognitive maps in rats, the latent learning, the concept of intervening variable, and the reinforcement not essential for learning. Learning is always purposive and goal-directed. So Tolman asserted that learning is always purposive and goal-directed. Note the word purposive and goal-directed. He held the notion that an organism acted or responded for some adaptive purpose. He believed individuals do more than merely respond to stimuli. They act on beliefs, attitudes, changing conditions, and they strive towards goals. Tolman saw behavior as holistic, as a whole, purposive, so with a purpose and cognitive in which we apply the informations we get into the reality. So, cognitive maps in rats. In his most famous experiment, one group of rats was placed at random starting locations in a maze, but the food was always in the same location. Another group of rats had the food placed in different locations, which always required exactly the same pattern of turns from their starting location. So, ani nga experiment, duwa lang jud ang iyang kapaingnan. So, ang unang experiment niya was for place learning. And ang usa is for response learning as shown in the image displayed niya. So, place learning. So, giunsa man sa rat pag abot sa iyang location is that nakahimo siya sa iyang hunahuna through the maze, nakahimo siya og cognitive maps. So, it was able to learn how to locate the food nga mao iyang goal. Sa response learning, ang iyang gihimo lang is gituluan niya og direction ang mga rats. So, with the same pattern sa iyang direction, ang rats gi-place niya upside down or kuan sa taas ba or sa kilid ba. Then ang food is gibalin-balin sab niya nga depending on kung unsang pattern ang kailangan niyang i-require. So, lantawas image di ba puro turn right. So, puro sa right niya gituluan niya nga sa direction nga right. So, unsa man iyang conclusion ani nga experiment? So, aning duha ang sa rats which is place learning katong sa location niya nakablo sa location is more mas dali nilang na kitaan ang food kaysa sa atong gitudloan lang niya og direction, di ba? So sa location, so atong sa rats nga naka-learn sa location, he found out nga mas dali silang makaadto sa ilang food kay tungod nga mangita ang rats og paagi nga ma-shortcut, mas madali ang paagi kaysa atong nakat-on og direction. So, latent learning. Latent learning is a kind of learning that remains or stays with the individual until needed. It is learning that is not outwardly manifested at once. According to Tolman, it can exist even without reinforcement. He demonstrated this in his rat experiments wherein rats apparently learned the maze by forming cognitive maps of the maze but manifested this knowledge of the maze only when they needed to. So, aning sa latent learning, ang akong ma-explain lang is for survivability sa rats, like muguwa na ang knowledge sa usa ka tawo if needed niya nga gamiton ni sa usa ka situation. And like makat-on lang ang tao sa tantong binalik-balik niya, like anang sa rats nga binalik-balik niya sa maze, nakatultol na lang siya asa ang galaw sanan bisag wala na ang food nga iyang butang. Concept of intervening variable. Intervening variables are variables that are not readily seen but serve as determinants of behavior. Tolman believed that learning is mediated or is influenced by expectations, perceptions, representations, needs, and other internal or environmental variables. So, intervening variables mao na siya ang mga butang nga ga-motivate sa usa ka tawo. So, like kita ron nganong ga eskwela man ta tungod kay naay mga rason like ganahan ta nga makatabang sa atong ginikanan ana di ba ani makita nimo nga naay purpose ang imuhang pag-eskwela. Reinforcement not essential for learning. Tolman concluded that the reinforcement is not essential for learning, although it provides an incentive for performance. In his studies, he observed that a rat was able to acquire knowledge of the way through a maze, to develop a cognitive map even in the absence of reinforcement. So, nasulti na, naisgot na ni sa latent learning ganiya, nga even without reinforcement, the food, so for survivability, mugawas di ba kinahanglan nga mugawas sa rat sa maze. So ani nga paagi nangita siya dalan nga makagawas lang jud sila sa maze even without reinforcement or the food.
Have a good day everyone. I am Alfred Cuevas Dulas and today I will be discussing about Albert Bandura's social learning theory. So during the 1960s, Albert Bandura conducted a series of experiments on observational learning collectively known as the Bobo-Doll experiments. These experiments had three stages. Stage 1 is modeling, Stage 2 is aggression arousal, Stage 3 test for delay imitation. So who is Albert Bandura? Albert Bandura is an American psychologist and originator of social cognitive theory who is probably best known for his modeling study on aggression, which demonstrated that children can learn behaviors through the observation of adults. So that is the Bobo-Doll experiment. The Albert Bandura social learning theory. Social learning theory focuses on the learning that occurs within a social context. It considers that people learn from one another, including such concepts as observational learning, imitation, and modeling. General principles of social learning theory. Number 1. People can learn by observing the behavior of others and the outcomes of those behaviors. Number 2. Learning can occur without a change in behavior. Behaviorists say that learning has to be represented by a permanent change in behavior. In contrast, social learning theorists say that because people can learn through observation alone, their learning may not necessarily be shown in their performance. Learning may or may not result in a behavior change. Number 3. Cognition plays a role in learning. Over the last 30 years, social learning theory has become increasingly cognitive in its interpretation of human learning awareness and expectations of future reinforcements or punishments that can have a major effect on the behaviors that people exhibit. Number 4. Social learning theory can be considered a bridge or a transition between behaviorist learning theories and cognitive learning theories. How the environment reinforces and punishes modeling. Number 1. The observer is reinforced by the model. For example, a student who changes dress to fit in with a certain group of students has a strong likelihood of being accepted and thus reinforced by that group. Number 2. The observer is reinforced by a third person. The observer might be modeling the actions of someone else. For example, an outstanding class leader or student. The teacher notices these compliments and praises the observer for modeling such behavior, thus reinforcing that behavior. we have number 3. The imitated behavior itself leads to reinforcing consequences. Many behaviors that we learn from others produce satisfying or reinforcing results. Number 4. Consequences of the model's behavior affect the observer's behavior vicariously. This is known as vicarious reinforcement. This is where the model is reinforced for a response and then the observer shows an increase in that same response. Contemporary social learning perspective of reinforcement and punishment. Contemporary theory proposes that both reinforcement and punishment have indirect effects on learning. They are not the sole or main cause. Reinforcement and punishment influence the extent to which an individual exhibits a behavior that has been learned. The expectation of reinforcement influences cognitive processes that promote learning. Therefore, attention plays a critical role in learning, and attention is influenced by the expectation of reinforcement. Cognitive factors in social learning. Number 1. Learning without performance. Bandura makes a distinction between learning through observation and the actual imitation of what has been learned. This is similar to Tolman's latent learning. Number 2 factor, cognitive processing during learning. Social learning theorists contend that attention is a critical factor in learning. Number 3 factor, expectations. As a result of being reinforced, people form expectations about the consequences that future behaviors are likely to bring. They expect certain behaviors to bring reinforcements and others to bring punishment. Number 4, reciprocal causation. Bandura proposed that behavior can influence both the environment and the person. In fact, each of these 3 variables, the person, the behavior, and the environment, can have an influence on each other. Fifth factor, modeling. There are different types of models. There is the live model, an actual person demonstrating the behavior. There can also be a symbolic model, which can be a person or action portrayed in some other medium such as television, videotape, computer programs. Behaviors that can be learned through modeling. Many behaviors can be learned at least partly through modeling. Research indicates that children become more aggressive when they observe aggressive or violent models. Moral thinking and moral behavior are influenced by observation and modeling. This includes moral judgments regarding right and wrong, which can in part develop through modeling. Conditions necessary for effective modeling to occur. Number 1 is attention. The person must first pay attention to the model. Number 2 is retention. The observer must be able to remember the behavior that has been observed. Number 3, motor reproduction. The third condition is the ability to replicate the behavior that the model has just demonstrated. Number 4 is motivation. The final necessary ingredient for modeling to occur is motivation. Effects of modeling on behavior. Number 1, modeling teaches new behaviors. 2, modeling influences the frequency of previously learned behaviors. Number 3, modeling may encourage previously forbidden behaviors. Number 4, modeling increases the frequency of similar behaviors. Educational implications of social learning theory. Students often learn a great deal simply by observing other people. 2. Describing the consequences of behavior can effectively increase the appropriate behaviors and decrease inappropriate ones. This can involve discussing with learners about the rewards and consequences of various behaviors. Modeling provides an alternative to shaping for teaching new behaviors. Instead of using shaping, which is operant conditioning, modeling can provide a faster, more efficient means for teaching new behavior. Number 4, teachers and parents must model appropriate behaviors and take care that they do not model inappropriate behaviors. Number 5, teachers should expose students to a variety of other models. This technique is especially important to break down traditional stereotypes.